AP Biology, Plant Diversity, Chapters 29 and 30, Part 2. In the previous part, we learned about the bryophytes and pteridophytes, and they're fairly simple plants, and they're found in the lower rocks as far as fossils are concerned. They evolved before gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms and angiosperms are more advanced land plants. They're better adapted for living on land, and especially the angiosperms, the flowering plants, have basically taken over the land part of this planet. Now there's plenty of gymnosperms like pine trees, but the most common land plant are angiosperms. So the two types of plants that have seeds are the gymnosperms, think Christmas trees, and the angiosperms, think everything else, basically everything that has flowers, even some things that don't look like they have flowers. The seed is a big advantage for living on land, and there's protection and a food supply inside that seed. There's also reduction of the gametophyte. If you remember, the gametophyte is haploid, or one set of chromosomes, so there isn't any redundancy, and the gametophyte is more sensitive to things like radiation and mutations because you don't have a backup copy of DNA on that second set of chromosomes if you're a haploid cell. The gametophyte also makes the gametes, and they're very delicate. They're very easy to break structures. So reducing the gametophyte and increasing the sporophyte protects the gametophyte and gives the gamete-producing structures in flowering plants and gymnosperms additional protection for living on land. The last big advantage of gymnosperms and angiosperms over bryophytes and pteridophytes is the evolution of pollen. Pollen is a lightweight structure produced by plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms, to protect the cells inside that will become two sperm nuclei. So think of pollen as the protective, lightweight, sticky structure in gymnosperms and angiosperms that allow the cell that becomes sperm to be transferred from flower to flower. Let's go ahead and write down these three things for the advantages of seed plants. First one is the advent of a seed. Second is reduction of the gametophyte. And the third is evolution of pollen. You should understand that these are the advantages that seed plants have over non-seed plants. All right, gymnosperms. When you think gymnosperms, think Christmas trees. They're the needle trees. The needles themselves are modified leaves, adapted for drier climates as well as colder climates, and they are the photosynthesizing parts of the plant. Doesn't include every gymnosperm, though. Pine trees are just a type of gymnosperm. There are others as well that you're going to see coming up. These are vascular plants. That means they have tubes, xylem and phloem, for transporting water and sugars. Remember, xylem's for water, phloem is for sugars, plant food. They have something called heterospory. Hetero means other, and they actually have a distinct male versus female gametophyte. And when you look at a pine tree, and you're going to see other pictures of this, the cones that you see that are woody are the female parts of the plant. And then if you see those soft, sticky cones, those are the male parts of the plant. Remember, in homospory, with the pteridophytes, especially those ferns, they had both the male and female parts on the same structure in the gametophyte. Let's go ahead and back it up to show you that. So you got a homospory, bisexual gametophyte, one structure creating both male and female gametes. And then here we have one plant producing male and female gametophytes. So they have separate structures on the plant producing the gametes. All right, the seeds are naked seeds. That means there's no fruit on the outside of it. We'll talk more about that later. However, keep in mind that there's a seed. Each one of these little parts of the cone is a seed, but there's nothing surrounding it. In the angiosperms, there is something surrounding it, and that is called a fruit, and that fruit is used to spread those seeds. Pollens are contains the male gametophyte within it, so the pollen grain has the male gametophyte to make the male gametes once they land on another cone. The life cycle in gymnosperms as well as angiosperms is dominated by the sporophyte. When you see a Christmas tree or any of those pine trees, that's all sporophyte or diploid cells, two sets of chromosomes. Coniferous trees you are familiar with are diploid, and we have a reduced microscopic gametophyte within the cone structures of these trees. So if you remember, with the bryophytes, the sporophyte was a small part of the life cycle. It was that little brown part at the top. Go back to that. Here we go. So we have the sporophyte here which is not that big compared to the green stuff at the bottom, which was all haploid gametophyte. So in the bryophytes, we have a haploid stage of life cycle dominant. Then with the pteridophytes, we now have the sporophyte stage dominant. However, it's still a fairly large part of the life cycle in the gametophyte. And that part in the gametophyte is this the structure here. This is the gametophyte, and it looks heart-shaped, and that's a different part of the life cycle. And we talked about that in part 1. However, you can still see it. It's not microscopic. When we get to the pteridophytes, now we're dealing with microscopic gametophytes. In fact, the male gametophyte is actually inside the pollen. All right. You should be familiar with why the reduction of the gametophyte occurred. Let's go and write down this bottom part here. Reduction of the gametophyte protects the delicate egg and embryo in the protective sporophyte. So this cone is sporophyte, but within it are the gametophyte. Protection from drought and ultraviolet radiation. Make sure you have that in your notes right there. All right, so we have another diagram here. We've got the bryophytes. See, the sporophyte is fairly small compared to the gametophyte. This is a water plant. We have spores. The spores will undergo mitosis to produce the gametophyte. Here we have the pteridophytes. The spores, which are haploid, produce the gametophyte here, which looks like a little heart. Remember, homospory produces both male and female gametes. They fuse together, form the sperm and sperm and egg fuse together to form the zygote, and then the zygote that's diploid will form the diploid sporophyte by mitosis. Then here we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. Notice the gametophyte is microscopic, it's reduced, and it's within and protected by the sporophyte. Here we don't have that. This is an adaptation for land plants to protect the delicate gametophyte. All right, here's some more gymnosperms. So they're not just pine trees and needle trees. Here we have ginkgo is a homeopathic remedy to increase memory. Remember, these things don't have large-scale studies done, so no one knows for sure if those remedies work. Here's another gymnosperm, cycads, so different variations. And then conifers. Here we have redwood trees, that's a conifer. Naked seeds, vascular tissue, pollen, pine trees. This was the bristlecone pine tree. Bristlecone pines are the longest living thing on this planet. The oldest one, by counting the rings, is over 6,000 years old. Juniper. Naked seeds means there's no surrounding fruit covering it, like an apple covers the seeds from an apple tree. That is not a gymnosperm seed. That's a different type of division. All right, life cycle here. We have meiosis. Remember, meiosis does not produce gametes in plants. It produces spores. And then these spores become the gametophyte. The gametophyte will produce the gametes, and those gametes are actually going to be produced from the pollen grains. The female gametophyte is within the cone seeds. So at the base of each one of these little seeds in here is the female gametophyte that makes the female gametes, the eggs. So when the pollen lands on the female cone, what happens is fertilization. The gametophyte makes the gametes. We got the male gametes and the female gametes coming together. That's a zygote. And then the zygote undergoes mitosis to produce the sporophyte again. And now here's the sporophyte producing spores that become the gametophyte, that make the gametes, and the cycle completes. And again, they're all variations of that basic diagram on alternation of generations. If you understand that basic diagram, you're good to go. Here we have some other pictures of the male and female parts of a plant. If you ever go to a pine tree and find like a sticky cone, that is the male part of the plant, and that produces the pollen. The woody part is the female part of the plant. That dust there is pollen, the male gametophyte that makes the gametes, the sperm. All right. Pollen eliminated the requirement for water for fertilization. Remember that pollen contains the male gametophyte, and if you have the male gametes living in water, the sperm with the little tail on the end, you can just swim through the water. However, if you're living on land, there isn't a whole lot of water on land other than lakes and rivers. So As an adaptation, we have pollen grains that have a lightweight structure that is sticky and can be carried by a variety of means, like wind and animals. All right, angiosperms, they're vascular plants also. They have xylem and phloem. They have distinct male and female gametophyte structures within the plant. They sometimes even have separate male and female plants. The flowers are specialized structures for sexual reproduction, attract pollinators and other functions. There's seeds with their fruit. That's a big difference between all the other types of plants. In gymnosperms, tritophytes, and bryophytes, there was no seed within a fruit. In fact, the only other plant that has seeds are the gymnosperms. Angiosperms have pollen, and their life cycle is also dominated by the sporophyte stage, just like the gymnosperms. Here we have some angiosperms. Again, they're the most common plants on this planet. If any of the trees that are big leafy trees, they're angiosperms. Grass is also angiosperms. Sometimes the flowers don't look like flowers. These are flowers for the grass there, and if they get fertilized, they produce seeds. Coevolution, remember, that is two species affecting each other's evolution. We're selecting for insects that recognize patterns that bring them to the food source, the nectar, and as a result, they spread the gametes, the pollen, from one plant to another. All these are different fruits. The definition of a fruit is a structure that has seeds within. So things like jalapenos and tomatoes and cucumbers, zucchini, all those are technically fruits. There is no such thing as a vegetable in science. That is a common term. All right, angiosperm life cycle. Angiosperm life cycle. Once again, it's the same alternation of generations. However, there's variations on the theme, and we're going to go through that now for angiosperms. Here we start with the zygote. Remember, the zygote will undergo mitosis to produce the sporophyte. And here we have the sporophyte. Remember, the brown represents diploid, 2 sets of chromosomes, blue haploid. Don't worry about the triploid yet. We're going to talk about that later in chapter 37, I think. All right, remember that the sporophyte produces spores. These spores are contained within the flower. There's 2 different parts of the flower, the male and female part. The spores produce the gametophyte, and the gametophyte for the male is inside the pollen grain, and that'll produce the gametes, the sperm without a tail. For the female part, the female gametophyte is within the base of the flower, and each one of these ovules has an egg inside. The egg is a gamete produced by mitosis from the female gametophyte. Now, this part here is all sporophyte. The gametophyte is microscopic inside. Meiosis, remember, makes spores, and then the spores become the gametophyte. The gametophyte makes the eggs. A flower is a modified shoot with 4 rings of modified leaves. At the base, we have sepals. We'll talk more about this in another class. The carpels are the female part, and you can kind of think females are, tend to be a little bit more social and will be more likely to carpool. Ooh, carpel, female. So carpel is the middle part here, and it includes a stigma, a style, and ovary. Stigma is just a landing pad for the pollen. Style is just a slender neck of the flower, and then the ovary contains 1 or more ovules with eggs inside. Now, this is a plant ovary. It's not made of the same stuff human ovaries are made of course. Stamen has men inside. So men, male, that's an easy one to remember. And surrounding the carpel is the stamen. Here we have stamen consisting of 2 parts, the anther, which produces the pollen, which contains the male gametophyte inside, and a filament, which is just kind of a stalk to hold it up. Go ahead and review these parts of a flower. You'll be taking notes on this later. If you take notes on it now, then you won't have to do it later. Here we have the stigma, the style, the ovary, all together make up the carpel. This whole thing is a stamen. Here we have the anther and the filament. The anther is going to make the pollen, which has the male gametophyte. The base of the ovary has the female gametophyte that makes the eggs inside the ovules. So after fertilization, after the male and female parts combine, we have a sporophyte developing within a seed. And that seed has a food source. Now these are not naked seeds. They have a surrounding fleshy covering of called a fruit. Now some of these fruits are big, like in the case of apples and pears and things like that, but some are fairly small. Here we have the fruit as well as the seed, and then the seed will germinate. We have sprouting, that's germination, roots going down, leaves going up. We'll talk more about that in a future class. And now we got our sporophyte again from the zygote inside the seed. Stigma, style, yellow stuff is pollen, anther, filament, the whole thing is stamen. Angiosperms are flowering plants. They produce flowers and fruit. There's two types of angiosperms, monocots and dicots. Monocots have one seed leaf. Here we have monocot, example would be grass, and they have parallel venation. Think of an ear of corn. Corn is a good example of a monocot. If you ever see the leaves on corn, they're all parallel, and then the leaves themselves, there's only one of them when the corn sprouts. Dicot has two seed leaves, so when they sprout they have two. Our plants, our mustard plants that we're planting, have two seed leaves, so they're dicots. And dicots also have leaves with net-like venation. They kind of branch out everywhere. Dicots, two seed leaves, leaves with net-like venation, veins, and broad leaf plants. These are more important. Talk more about that later. Monocots, one seed leaf, leaves with parallel side-by-side veins. All right, this table you should have in your notes. So pause at this point and copy this down. You don't have to draw out the pictures in any kind of detail. However, monocots, dicots. Monocots have one cotyledon. You can just write that down for now. We'll talk about that later. It's basically just the seed leaves that will be produced. Veins are usually parallel in monocots. Dicots net-like. You can see that there. Put this in there. We're going to see better pictures of this coming up. Vascular bundles arranged in a complex way. There's kind of like scattered around, and it's kind of arranged in a almost random pattern, it seems like. For dicots, they have a ring of vascular bundles, and that's in the stem. Monocots tend to have a fibrous root system. Think corn or grass. Tap roots usually present in a dicot. Think like a carrot. That would be a great example of a dicot. This one's the hardest one to remember. Floral parts are usually in multiples of 3 for monocots, and dicots have multiples of 4 or 5. But especially remember these veins, the seed leaves, and the root system. But I'll probably give you like 2 or 3 clues in a question, and you'll have to figure out if it's a monocot or dicot. All right, so gametophytes of seed plants. In gymnosperms, the male gametophyte is within the pollen of the male cone. In angiosperms, it's the pollen of the anthers of the flower. Remember, there's heterospory in gymnosperms where they have separate cones that are sticky that produce the male gametophyte, the pollen. The female gametophyte develops in the female cone in gymnosperms like pine trees. In angiosperms like maple trees or tulips, the gametophyte develops in the ovaries of the flower, in the base of the carpel. In gymnosperms, they're naked seeds. That's probably the most important thing on this list here. They don't have any fruit covering. The seeds in an angiosperm are protected inside the ovary, and the ovary wall develops into a fruit, like an apple. So here we have some evolutionary trends that you should be familiar with. The first thing you should know is about vascular tissue, tubes for transport. This is the first thing that was an evolutionary trend in land plants. Xylem and phloem. Bryophytes don't have it. The vascular plants are tritophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. And the advantage, you can increase your size, get that sunlight first, and you can transport water from the ground to where it's drier up in the air. The next step is sperm dissemination. Flagellated sperm, found in bryophytes and tritophytes, don't work very well on land. Windblown or animal-carried pollen works a little bit better. Gymnosperms have pollen as well as angiosperms. Evolutionary advantage, remember that pollen has a tough coat. It's lightweight. It's protected from drying out, desiccation. So this is an adaptation for dry terrestrial conditions to spread sperm. That was the next trend in the evolution of land plants. And then the third trend, and you should be familiar with these trends in order, is seeds. The seedless plants are the bryophytes and tritophytes. The seed plants are gymnosperms and angiosperms. They both produce seeds. The evolutionary advantage is that we have a food supply inside, and we have a tough coat for protection, and that's important for living on land. As a general trend, as far as the reduction of the gametophyte, you should be familiar with this. The gametophyte is dominant in bryophytes. The sporophyte's dominant in pteridophytes like ferns, but it's still a fairly big gametophyte, that heart-shaped structure. But when we get to gymnosperms and angiosperms, the gametophyte is so small it's microscopic. It's totally protected by the sporophyte. What's the advantage? Reduction of the gametophyte protects delicate eggs and embryo from within the protective sporophyte, and protection from drought and ultraviolet radiation. So let's go and review this. I would like you to write this down. The 4 groups represent the 4 great episodes of evolution of land plants. You should be familiar with the order. What evolved first, second, third, and fourth. Also, you should be familiar with the adaptation for all plants for living on land, which would be the cuticle, waxy covering, as well as having an apical meristem, areas to grow up and down without the tubes, and some other things that we talked about earlier. All right, so this is the end of part 2 of chapter 29 and 30. Go ahead and review some of the things that you learned about in this lesson. This ends part 2 of chapter 29 and 30 for AP Biology.